We go live to the United Nations. The representative of St. Vincent and the Grenadines speaks at the 24th plenary meeting on the need to end the U.S. blockade against Cuba.
Welcomed the steps that were taken between 2015 and 2016 by Cuba and the United States to commence the process of normalizing their diplomatic relations, which began a new chapter in the history of peace and coexistence among nations of the Americas. However, we regret that the embargo remains a reality for the Cuban people and unquestionably continues to be the main obstacle of normal development in Cuba. The report of the Secretary General A/78/84 confirms the cost of the policy for Cuba, as it does substantial and unjustifiable harm to the well-being of the Cuban people and is contrary to the desire for peace of the peoples of Latin America and the Caribbean, as set out in the Proclamation of Latin America and the Caribbean as a zone of peace. The economic, commercial, and financial embargo on Cuba is contrary to the letter, spirit, purposes, and principles of the Charter of the United Nations and international law. CELAC reiterates its firm rejection of the application of laws and measures that are contrary to international law, such as the Helms-Burton Act, including their extraterritorial effects and the increasing persecution of Cuba's international financial transactions, which run counter to the political desires of the international community. We are also opposed to the unjust inclusion of Cuba on the list of state sponsors of terrorism, which, in addition to being unsubstantiated, has increased the chilling effect of the embargo-related restrictions and worsened Cuba's chances of establishing commercial and financial relations with international partners. We urge the government of the United States to put an end to those measures. CELAC underscores its special declaration on the necessity of ending the economic, commercial, and financial embargo imposed by the United States against Cuba, adopted at the 7th Summit of the Heads of State and Government of the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, held in Buenos Aires, Argentina on 24th January 2023. In it, we requested that the government of the United States abide by the successive resolutions of the General Assembly and, in response to repeated calls from the international community, put an end to the economic, commercial, and financial embargo against Cuba. Furthermore, CELAC reiterates its deep concerns about the tightening of the policy and its rejection of the extraterritorial dimension of the embargo, which has had a severe impact on Cuba's international financial transactions and the welfare of the Cuban people. The Charter of the United Nations sets out rights, obligations, and principles, and have become part of the legal heritage of humankind as well as international law. They should not be violated or undermined by any member. Member states should modify their national and international actions in line with the rights, obligations, and principles set out in our Charter. The Community of Latin American and Caribbean States strongly supports the adoption of draft resolution A/78/L.5 entitled Necessity of Ending the Economic, Commercial, and Financial Embargo Imposed by the United States of America against Cuba. We underscore the inconsistency of applying unilateral coercive measures that are not supported by international law or by the letter, spirit, purposes, or principles of the Charter of the United Nations. We reiterate our call on the United States to respond to the appeal by the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean, every region of the world and its own people, to put an end once and for all to the unjust embargo on Cuba. I thank you, Mr. President, and I now beg your indulgence as I will deliver a few additional remarks in my national capacity. Before beginning, allow me to align with the statements to be delivered on behalf of the Caribbean community, CARICOM, and that which I just delivered on behalf of the CILAC. Every year, by virtue of the resolution entitled Necessity of Ending the Economic, Commercial, and Financial Embargo imposed by the United States of America against Cuba, the General Assembly pronounces overwhelmingly in favor of Cuba. This text, since its adoption in 1992, reflects the membership's unwavering condemnation of the ongoing blockade imposed on Cuba. Mr. President, St. Vincent and the Grenadines' opposition to the ongoing measures is founded on our steadfast advocacy of the bedrock principles of the multilateral order, which are enshrined unambiguously in the Charter of the United Nations, namely the principles of sovereignty and non-intervention and non-interference in the internal affairs of a state. The equal application of and adherence to these principles, along with the others that have been entrenched in the Charter, play an indispensable role in safeguarding peaceful coexistence amongst nations. To this end, we underscore that the continued imposition of this embargo is not only a violation of the Charter and affront to international law, but also inhumane, unjust, and anachronistic. I apologize. We therefore appeal to the member states to honor their obligations under the Charter to avoid promulgating and applying laws and measures that fall within those set out in the resolution. We further appeal to the states that have imposed such measures to undertake the necessary steps and actions required to repeal or invalidate them. We unequivocally reject the unilateral imposition of illegal and counterproductive measures by some states on others as responsible actors in the international community. Member states have a legal and moral obligation to oppose extraterritorial application of domestic policies which violate international law, the overarching framework that was curated and established to safeguard our peaceful and prosperous existence. Mr. President, as we look toward implementing the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, we recall member states' commitment to leaving no one behind. The ongoing embargo is an unnecessary barrier to Cuba's ability to achieve these goals on the same footing as the rest of the international community. While we recognize the significant advancements that Cuba has made in areas such as healthcare and education, as well as the commendable commitment shown to meeting the Sustainable Development Goals in spite of the existing embargo, we also express our grave concern about the stymieing and palpable impact that the embargo has on Cuba, which is borne directly by its people and further affects the region. Noting that these illegal measures can run counter to the letter, spirit, principles, and purposes of the Charter of the United Nations, St. Vincent and the Grenadines expresses its strong support for the adoption of resolution entitled The Necessity of Ending the Economic, Commercial, and Financial Embargo imposed by the United States of America against Cuba, set out in Resolution A/78/L.5. We reiterate our position that the unconditional lifting of the embargo is a prerequisite to any meaningful rapprochement between the United States and Cuba. They urge the United States to take heed of the consistent appeals echoed by member states who oppose these harmful policies. This is the only way to create an environment conducive for mutually respectful dialogue that facilitates a sustainable path forward. I thank you, Mr. President.
I should like to thank the distinguished representative of St. Vincent and the Grenadines speaking on behalf of CELAC, and I now invite the distinguished representative of El Salvador speaking on behalf of the Central American.
We were listening to the statements of the representative of St. Vincent and the Grenadines at the 24th plenary meeting of the United Nations General Assembly. The representative denounced the cost and harm of the U.S. blockade has on Cuba. CELAC renews its call for the immediate lifting of the blockade. The representative also rejects the inclusion of Cuba by the U.S. in the list of nations that sponsor terrorism and demand that the U.S. government removes Cuba from said list. The representative also calls on the U.S. to abide by the draft resolution that has been approved over the years. We will have more updates in upcoming news briefs, so stay tuned with teleSUR.